One of the things I love about the community around this YouTube channel is you guys sometimes come up with some ingenious ideas that either I never would have thought to do myself, or in some cases I just don't have the skills to do myself. And one of the really cool things that someone contributed here in the last few weeks is a couple of months ago I started doing these tier list videos. The very first one I did was the text editor tier list, where I took like 15 text editors and put them in various tiers from great, good, okay, meh, and yuck. And what I did is I just did this in GIMP. I created a simple graphic in GIMP for all of the tier list rankings, and then I used the same GIMP graphic because I saved it because I figured I'd do more tier list videos. I did another one for a tier list for tiling window managers, and again I used GIMP to do this thing. And people were like, man, that's kind of crazy using GIMP for something like that. Why don't you just use a web app? So if I go over to my subreddit over at r/distrotube, someone posted this about a week ago, 7 days ago, and you can see free and open source tier list app, and he has a GitHub repo. It's called dt-tier list, and he also went ahead and put the app on the web at this particular URL. I'll link to the URL, of course, in the show description. And this is his web app running. So I thought, this is so cool. I was so impressed with the work this guy did that I thought, in honor of him contributing this app to the community, I should make a tier list video today. Now comes the part where I need to figure out what I should try to rank as a tier list today. What kind of applications? Doing text editors was pretty easy. I've used a ton of them. Using tiling window managers, and ranking them is pretty easy because I've used so many of them. What else have I used a lot of that I feel pretty comfortable I can rank a whole bunch of these things rather quickly? Terminal emulators. So please bear in mind this will be the first time I've used this web app, so if I struggle with how to use it, just keep that in mind, although I think it's pretty self-explanatory. I believe if I just started adding something, like if I added Alacrity, hit enter, yeah, it goes down here, and then I could just drag it into the appropriate tier. That's pretty cool. Let me go ahead and plug in, I don't know, 10, 12 terminal emulators. I'm going to put all the terminal emulators that I have used extensively over the years, and also I'm going to make sure that I include some terminal emulators I've discussed on videos in the past, because I know some of you guys, if I don't include those, are going to ask me about them. So it won't be every terminal emulator under the sun, because honestly there's like 100 of them that are pretty commonly used on Linux. We have so many terminal emulators, so I'm not going to try to rank all of them. I'm just going to stick with the ones that I know the best, or the ones that I've covered on video in the past. So the terminals I've decided to go with, I chose 12 here. We're going to rank Alacrity, Edex UI, GNOME Terminal, Kitty, Console, LX Terminal, Suckless's Simple Terminal, ST, Termonad, XFCE Terminal, URX, VT, Xterm, and Yakwake. And we're going to start with Alacrity. For those of you that have been following the channel for the last, I would say, 2 to 3 years, you know Alacrity is kind of my terminal emulator of choice these days, and Alacrity has to be in the great tier. Alacrity is one of these new school kind of terminal emulators because it's GPU accelerated, which means it's blazing fast. Alacrity also is really good at rendering Unicode characters, various glyphs. It's also cross-platform, which is a big plus, and by cross-platform I mean truly cross-platform. Windows, Mac, and Linux is typically what we think cross-platform. Alacrity has a really nice config file with a ton of options in it that you can configure it to your heart's content with custom key bindings and theming and things like that. One thing about Alacrity is it's kind of minimal in design, which I like. So you don't get tabs with Alacrity. You also don't get ligature support in Alacrity, although I think they may be working on that. I've had some conflicting reports on the internet about Alacrity and ligatures. I don't use ligatures myself, but I think they have plans to eventually support ligatures. Tabs, I don't think they really plan on supporting tabs anytime soon. But to be honest, I won't really fault any of these terminal emulators if they don't have tab support or ligature support, because I think those are kind of minor things with terminal emulators, because you can get tabbing through other means. You don't necessarily need the terminal emulator itself to support tabbing. And for those wondering about adding tab support to many of these terminal emulators that don't support tabs, there's 3 ways I can think of. You could either use Suckless's tabbed program. That works, and it's one that I've used in the past. It's actually a quite nice program. Another thing you can do if you're a Tmux user, Tmux of course supports tabbing, so just launch Tmux inside your terminal. The other thing you can do if you're using a tiling window manager, many of them have a tabbed kind of layout, so you can have multiple terminal emulators opened in tabs inside your window manager. That works as well. Moving on to the next terminal emulator is edexui. I did a video about edexui about 4 years ago, I would say. It was a very popular video, and a lot of people really found this particular terminal emulator a really neat project. It's an Electron app, and it's something really weird. The whole design of it looks kind of futuristic. It's something out of a sci-fi movie. It has all these whiz-bang effects and widgets on the screen. It's not a terminal emulator like you would typically think. It's something really weird, and to me, I think it's nice as a gimmick, but the fact that it's an Electron app and the fact that, again, it's not like a normal terminal emulator, it's more for people that want to show off, or more for people that they want to have this thing running on their computer to seem like they're hackers. edexui definitely is in the yuck tier. It's not something I would actually use as my daily driver as far as my terminal. Next up is the GNOME terminal, and for me, the GNOME terminal, I'm going to put in the okay category. I could almost put it in the good category. It's a pretty decent terminal emulator. It really has all the basics. It has everything that I think most people would expect in a terminal emulator. It has tab support, it has URL detection, it has nice graphical menus, and preferences kind of category you can choose in the menu where you can easily set colors inside the terminal. You can set different color schemes, and it actually allows you to have multiple profiles in the terminal. That way different people can have their own different profile within the terminal, or the same person could have different profiles within the terminal, depending on what kind of work you're doing one day versus the next. The only thing that kind of prevents me from making GNOME terminal either good or great is the fact that it's part of the GNOME project and it's using the VTE library, which isn't the greatest as far as performance. I like things a little bit more fast, lightweight, especially if you're opening a lot of terminals all the time like I typically am. You're probably going to want something not quite as heavy as GNOME terminal, and I'm going to put a lot of these similar applications because there's several terminal emulators down here that are very similar to GNOME terminal as far as they're GTK terminals, VTE terminals. They have a lot of the same features, functionality, and a lot of the same performance problems. I can go ahead and tell you right now, I'd probably put LX terminal here with it. I'd probably put XFCE terminal here with it because they're all kind of really very, very similar terminal emulators. Everything I could talk about with GNOME terminal, I could say the same thing about with LX terminal and the XFCE4 terminal as well. So let's just go ahead and put all of those in the same category. They're okay terminals. If I had to use them, I'm fine with them. They're pretty decent terminals. If I have options to install other things, yes, there's several other ones that I think are better choices. Next up is one of the better choices, Kitty. Kitty is very similar to Alacrity. It's one of these new school GPU accelerated terminal emulators, except where Alacrity tries to be more minimal. It does all of the basic features I think most people expect a terminal emulator to do. Kitty tries to give you everything and the kitchen sink. So, you didn't get tabs or ligatures with Alacrity. Kitty is going to give you both tabs and ligatures. So that could be a positive for some people. For some people, I would say for most people, that's probably not a big deal because, again, tabs and ligatures for me, not that big of a deal for a terminal emulator. I think one of the cool features with Kitty is they have this framework where you can extend Kitty. It's essentially adding your own scripts to Kitty that can be executed inside the terminal, the Kitty terminal, and these This framework and these scripts are called kittens, which is kind of a cute name, but that's a really neat feature for a terminal emulator. Now, one downside with Kitty, it's not a downside where I would knock it out of the great tier, but I will say as far as performance, I find Alacrity to perform a little better than Kitty as far as a little lighter, a little less RAM usage. The other thing that could be a knock on Kitty for some people, because being cross-platform is a big deal, because a lot of people have to work on Windows, Mac, and Linux, and you can get Alacrity on all three platforms. Kitty, as far as I know of, does not have a Windows version. It does have a Mac version, and of course it runs on Linux. Next up is KDE's Console, and Console, I really have to put it in the good category. Now, I don't use Console that often. The only time I use Console is if I'm in a KDE distribution, and it's already installed with KDE, right? And I like the terminal. Now, the problem is I never install Console if I'm not using KDE, because there's KDE dependencies to it. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But Console does so much as far as it's got a ton of features. It's got tabbing. It's got the split view mode. It does transparency well. Of course, you can change color schemes, set profiles. It has some built-in support with some other Plasma features. For example, support for the Dolphin file manager, again, for those using Plasma. Again, Console's kind of designed for Plasma, and that's kind of why I can't really put it in the great tier, even though feature-wise it probably belongs there, but because it's not as light and it's so tied to KDE, I've got to knock it down to just the good tier. Next up is the terminal emulator I think I'm going to have the hardest time ranking, and that is Suckless's ST. That's the simple terminal. And ST, I still use ST. I've used ST for 4 or 5 years now. There for about a year or two, I used ST as my main terminal emulator. It's that good, right? And I still have ST installed when I log into my DWM desktop environment. DWM, just trying to keep that full Suckless experience, I have ST set as the terminal for that particular window manager. And for me, I think I'm going to put ST, I'm going to have to put it as a good option. There's some things that really prevent it from being great, but the things that it can do and some of the features it has, I definitely think it deserves to at least be in the good tier. So let's start with the positives. Why is it good? Well, it's light, it's fast, it renders Unicode characters and glyphs and all of that stuff really well. Depending on how you patch ST, it could have ligature support. It does not have tab support, but being a Suckless project, you typically are going to run ST inside Suckless's tabbed program to get you tabs, or like I mentioned earlier, you can just use tmux inside ST to also get tabs. Now let's talk about the negatives with ST. Why is it not in the great tier? What's preventing it from being there? It's because it's a Suckless program, meaning you have to patch it for some basic functionality, and because you have to patch it and then recompile, that's kind of a headache, especially when you're making minor changes. Like if I want to change my color scheme, I go set some colors in the stconfig.def.h or whatever, and then I have to do sudo make install and recompile ST. That is a hassle just for changing colors. That's something you don't have to do with any other terminal emulator on this list, and that's just kind of strange. The other thing is ST has gotten better here over the years. When I first started using ST, by default, it didn't come with any kind of scroll back feature, so you couldn't actually scroll back through the terminal. Which is crazy. You had to patch ST to do that. Now the Suckless guys have come around to where ST kind of does this out of the box, gives you that scroll back feature, but there's still a lot of stuff with ST that you're probably going to want to patch ST for. Next up on the list is Termonad, and kind of like Edex UI, Termonad is not a very common terminal emulator. The reason I did a video about Termonad is because it is a terminal emulator. It's one of these VTE terminal emulators similar to GNOME Terminal and some of these other terminal emulators we've talked about. So it uses GNOME's VTE widget library to create their terminal, but it's configured in Haskell, right? You have almost like a xmonad-like config file with Termonad, and you go and edit this thing in Haskell, to set the colors and key bindings and things like that. And that was really neat. I thought that was a really cool idea. It's something I'd never really seen a terminal emulator do, is, have to use a real programming language to actually configure it and customize it. And it's a great idea. The problem with Termonad is, ever since I made that video about it about 3-4 years ago, After about 6 months of using it, all of a sudden it no longer worked for me. I can't get it to install anymore. I can't get it to install on archlinux at all, and I can't actually build it myself using something like Cabal or Stag. I don't think whoever's working on it, they probably, at this point, probably just abandoned the project. I don't know what's going on with it, but because it's not really usable, I have to put it down here in the yuck category. I wouldn't even mention it as again, I made the video about it in the past, and I figured somebody would ask me about it, so let's go ahead and discuss it now. Right now, yeah, I can't recommend Termonad at all. I doubt you're going to get that thing to work if you try to build it. Now let's discuss some of the old guard here, right? URXVT and Xterm. These are terminal emulators that have been around since the beginning of time. So URXVT, I'm going to put in the meh category, and Xterm I'm also going to put in the meh category. They're very similar terminal emulators. They're both very minimal out of the box. They're both very ugly and almost unreadable out of the box, as far as they were designed in a different computing era where monitors were very small resolution, 640 by 480 or whatever the hell the monitor resolutions might have been back in the 1980s. And these things, you can customize them a little bit. So you can go into your X resources file and customize the colors and the fonts. You can make them usable. And I've used both as my main terminal emulator in the past because they are light. I will give them that. They're light. They're fast. They're much better on resources than most of the stuff above them here in the tier list. But because they're not that usable out of the box, I've got to knock them a bit. I will also say that Xterm and URXVT, they're not the best at displaying various Unicode characters and special glyphs and special characters and, boxes and things like that. Xterm is a little better than URXVT. Xterm is okay at displaying some of that stuff. It's not great. URXVT is actually horrible at displaying some Unicode stuff, which is really weird because URXVT is an abbreviation. The U in the name actually stands for Unicode. But when you go and do a test with some of these Unicode cheat sheets, I'll go to the internet and I'll grab a text file that's full of various weird Unicode things, and I'll run it through URXVT, and like 80% of the stuff doesn't render correctly in URXVT. So I've got to knock, that's why they're in the meh category. The one thing I will say about URXVT for performance, as far as speed, it has a daemon, so you can actually run the URXVT daemon in the background. That way, when you have to bring up terminals, they just kind of pop up immediately, and that's really fast. The downside of the daemon, though, is that everything is tied to the daemon. All your terminals are tied to the URXVT daemon, meaning they're fast and peppy, but if the daemon ever crashes, all your terminal emulators also crash. So that's the negative with that. And I know I'm going to get some hate in the comments below for putting both URXVT and Xterm in the meh category, because I know many people, especially tiling window manager users and Linux power users, a lot of you guys, URXVT or Xterm is probably your main terminal emulator. And again, I've used both as my main terminal emulator. I've used URXVT as my terminal of choice for years before I switched to other things. I used Xterm as my terminal emulator of choice for a year or two at one point. And they were, again, they're okay. Well, they're not really okay because I put them in the meh category. But I really think that I put up with a lot of things that I shouldn't have at the time. I think a lot of people run these terminal emulators for the cool factor because they're kind of old school. But honestly, everything above them is just a better terminal. And last on my list is Yaquake. I did a video about Yaquake a few months back, and it's a KDE terminal similar to console, except this is your KDE drop-down terminal. And for me, even though it's KDE, it's essentially console as a drop-down terminal. A drop-down terminal is you hit a hotkey and the terminal drops down from the top of the screen like halfway so you can do something, and then you hit the hotkey to toggle it to go away. You can think of drop-down terminals as kind of like scratch pads. In tiling window managers, we have what are known as scratch pads, where you hit a key binding to bring whatever program you have set to your scratch pad to pull up, and then you hit the key binding again to toggle it to go away. It doesn't close the program, it just makes it go away until I hit the hotkey to bring it back. That's kind of what your drop-down terminals are, and Yaquake, being console in drop-down form, I'm going to knock it for being a drop-down terminal just because of functionality, because I don't think most people are going to want that. But as far as being a good terminal, yeah, everything that console has, the tabs and the preferences and all of that stuff, yeah, that works. It's just the fact that it's a drop-down terminal. I wouldn't use it as my terminal emulator of choice, especially as a tiling window manager user. I don't think most people using tiling window managers would have a need for a drop-down terminal at all, the fact that we have scratch pads. So those are the 12 terminal emulators that I was going to rank. Now, I could talk about a few others. I haven't used them enough to where I feel real comfortable talking about them, but some of the other ones I've used in the past, I've used Qt Terminal, the Qt Terminal, Qt Terminal. Terminology I use sometimes when I'm looking at Enlightenment distributions. Terminology is part of the Enlightenment desktop environment. There's also Terminator, which is a very popular terminal emulator that sometimes is installed by default on Linux distributions that I take a look at. But the only one I've used extensively enough to where I really would feel comfortable giving it any kind of ranking. I mean, Qt Terminal I've used enough. Let's go ahead and add Qt Terminal to the list down here. Qt Terminal, I'll put it in the OK category because honestly, it's very similar to GNOME Terminal, LX Terminal, XFCE Terminal. Yeah, it's one of these OK terminals that has the built-in features you expect, tabs and ligature, and you set your color schemes and all that. It's an OK terminal. So there's my tier list for terminals. Let me know in the comments below what you agree with, what you disagree with, what would be in your great tier, what would be in your yuck tier. Now, before I go, I need to thank a few special people. I need to thank Dustin, Gabe, James, Matt, Maxim, Michael, Mitchell, Paul, West, Wanya Bald, Homie, Alan, Armor Dragon, Chuck, Commander Gregory, Yokai, Dylan, Marstrom, Jan, Alexander, Peace Argent, Door, Polytech, Realities for Less, Red Prophet, Steven, Tools, Devler, Willie. These guys, they're my highest tiered patrons over on Patreon. Without these guys, this terminal emulator tier list would not have been possible. The show is also brought to you by each and every one of these fine ladies and gentlemen. All these names you're seeing on the screen right now, these are all my supporters over on Patreon because I don't have any corporate sponsors. I'm sponsored by you guys, the community. If you like my work and want to support me, subscribe to DistroTube over on Patreon. All right, guys. Peace. And be sure to leave a thank you to the guy that created this web app.